I don't need a mate." The words came out rough, almost like an accusation, as the storm-gray eyes of the Alpha King fixed on the red-haired woman changing his bandages with gentle hands. She froze, her fingers still pressed against his chest, feeling the strong heartbeat beneath scarred skin. Cale Northbourne, the feared Alpha King of the Frostpeak Kingdom, the man who had unified entire territories through blood and iron will, was vulnerable, and he hated every second of it. "You're not weak," she responded softly, not looking away. "You're wounded. There's a difference. There is no difference for a king." Thelina sighed, returning to work on the deep wounds that had almost killed him in the blizzard. She was just a rejected Omega, a woman who had fled her own pack after having her heart shattered by an Alpha who deemed her unworthy. She had hidden in this forgotten village, at the edge of the world, wanting only to disappear. And then, on a night of raging storm, she found this man dying in the snow. She should have left him there, should have moved on and protected her already broken heart. But something about him, something in the way his eyes opened for a brief moment and looked at her not with disgust, but with something close to surprise, made her drag him into her small cottage. Now, 3 days later, he was awake, and irritated, and absolutely magnificent, even covered in blood and sweat. "Why did you save me?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost vulnerable. "You don't know me. You owe me nothing." She met his eyes, and in that moment, something shifted. Something ignited in the space between them. A spark neither expected. "Because," she whispered, "everyone deserves to be saved. Even kings who think they need no one." And so began the story of how a rejected Omega melted the heart of the coldest Alpha King in the north. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from and how old you are. I hope you enjoy this story. He stood at the edge of the world, where ice met sky, and declared to no one and everyone that he needed nothing. No warmth, no softness, no mate. The cold Alpha King, they called him. Cale Northbourne, ruler of the Frostpeak Kingdom, a man carved from stone and winter itself. His beard was black as a moonless night, streaked with silver frost that never seemed to melt. His hair fell in dark waves past his shoulders, and his eyes held the pale gray of a storm that promised no mercy. He was strength incarnate, a king who had unified the northern territories through blood and iron will, who had built walls around his heart higher than the mountains that cradled his realm. He had no need for the bond that lesser wolves craved. He had seen what love did to strong men. It made them weak, vulnerable, breakable. And Cale Northbourne refused to break. But the moon goddess, it seemed, had a different plan. Far to the south, in the Crimson Vale Pack, a girl with hair like autumn fire learned what it meant to be unwanted. Thelina was 20 years old the night her world shattered. She stood in the center of the pack gathering, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Around her, wolves whispered and watched, their eyes glinting with judgment and barely concealed disgust. She could smell it on them, the disappointment, the scorn, the way they looked at her as if she were something broken, something less, an Omega, the weakest designation, the most disposable. Alpha Marcus stood before her, tall and golden and cruel. He had been everything to her once, in the secret chambers of her foolish heart. She had dared to hope, to dream, that perhaps she could be more than what her biology dictated. But the bond that had snapped into place on her 20th birthday, that invisible thread that should have tied them together for eternity, was met with nothing but revulsion in his eyes. "I, Alpha Marcus of the Crimson Vale Pack, reject you, Thelina Ashwood, as my mate." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that would never stop spreading. The bond stretched and tore, a phantom pain that ripped through her chest and left her gasping. She heard someone crying, and realized distantly that it was her. The packlands seemed to tilt and spin, faces blurring together into a tapestry of contempt. "Accept it," Marcus said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Accept the rejection so we can both be free." Free. As if this was freedom. As if being unmoored from the one person fate had chosen for you was anything but falling. But Thelina lifted her chin, her green eyes bright with unshed tears, and spoke the words that would break her completely. "I accept." The bond snapped. Something fundamental inside her broke open and bled, a wound that no medicine could heal. The pack erupted in murmurs, in satisfied nods, in the quiet relief that came from removing something they viewed as flawed. Marcus turned away from her without another word, and that dismissal hurt more than the rejection itself. She did not remember running. Did not remember gathering her few belongings. Did not remember the way her feet carried her past the borders of Crimson Vale and into the wilderness beyond. She only remembered the cold, and the way it numbed everything, made her feel less and less until she was nearly nothing at all. Days blurred together. She traveled north, drawn by instinct toward the mountains, toward places where no one would know her shame. She found work in a small human settlement on the edge of the Frost Peak territories, a village so remote and forgotten that even her Omega scent seemed to fade into insignificance. She cleaned floors in the tavern, mended clothes, made herself small and useful and invisible. The villagers were kind in their distant way, but Thelina kept herself apart. She had learned the cost of hoping for connection. Better to be alone, safer to feel nothing at all. She lived in a tiny cottage at the edge of the village, a place that had been abandoned for years before she claimed it. The roof leaked, and the windows rattled in their frames, but it was hers. She patched the holes with whatever she could find, planted herbs in the small garden out back, and told herself that this was enough, that survival was enough. The loneliness settled into her bones like an old ache, something she learned to live with, to ignore. She spoke little, smiled less, and when she looked at her reflection in the cracked mirror above her wash basin, she barely recognized the girl who stared back. Her red hair had grown long and wild, her face had thinned, and her eyes held a haunted quality that never quite faded. Winter came early that year. The first snows fell in late autumn, blanketing the world in white silence. The villagers prepared for the long months ahead, stockpiling food and firewood, securing their homes against the bitter cold that ruled these northern lands. Thelina worked harder, took on more tasks, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from wandering down dark paths. And then came the storm. It arrived like a living thing, a howling beast of wind and ice that descended upon the mountains with terrifying fury. The sky turned the color of old bruises, and the snow fell so thick and fast that visibility dropped to nothing. The village elder ordered everyone inside, barred the doors, and they waited for the tempest to pass. But Thelina, returning from the tavern in the early moments of the storm, heard something that made her stop. A sound, low and pained, barely audible above the wind. She should have kept walking, should have rushed to her cottage and bolted herself inside. Instead, she turned toward the forest, toward the sound, her heart inexplicably racing. "Hello?" she called out, her voice immediately swallowed by the storm. "Is someone there?" Another sound, a growl, weak and rasping. She pushed forward, squinting against the driving snow, her thin cloak offering almost no protection against the cold. Her fingers were already going numb, her breath coming in harsh clouds. This was madness. She was going to freeze to death out here, looking for something that was probably just an injured animal that would attack her if she got too close. But she kept going. And then she saw him. A man, collapsed in the snow near the tree line. He was massive, even crumpled as he was, his body a dark shape against the white landscape. Blood stained the snow around him, black in the dim light. For a moment, Thelina's instincts screamed at her to run. This was a wolf, an alpha. She could sense it even without being able to see his face. And alphas were dangerous, especially wounded ones. But something stronger than fear propelled her forward. Perhaps it was the healer's instinct that all Omegas possessed, that need to nurture and protect. Or perhaps it was something else, something she could not name. She knelt beside him, her hands hovering over his body, unsure where to start. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and labored. His clothes were torn and soaked with blood, and she could see the deep gashes across his torso, the way his left arm hung at an unnatural angle. "I need to get you inside," she whispered, though she knew he could not hear her. "Please, you have to help me." As if in response to her plea, his eyes fluttered open. For a moment, she was caught in the pale gray storm of his gaze, and something jolted through her chest, a spark of recognition that made no sense. But then his eyes rolled back, and he went limp again. Thelina did not know where she found the strength. She was small, barely reaching his shoulder even if he had been standing, and he was solid muscle and power. But she managed to get her arms under his shoulders, managed to drag him through the snow, inch by agonizing inch, back toward her cottage. By the time she got him through the door, her arms were shaking and her lungs burned from the effort. The storm raged outside, rattling the walls, as she struggled to get him to her small bed. She ended up laying him on the floor instead, near the fireplace, where she could tend to him more easily. Her hands worked automatically, reaching for her meager supplies of medicine and bandages. She had learned basic healing from her mother before she died, and had picked up more from necessity over the years. She cut away his ruined shirt, revealing a body that was a map of violence. Old scars layered beneath fresh wounds, each telling a story of survival. The gashes were deep, made by claws, and already showing signs of infection. She cleaned them as best she could, her fingers gentle despite their trembling, and packed them with poultices made from the herbs she had dried over the summer. His arm was dislocated, and she had to brace herself against the wall as she reset it, wincing at the wet pop of bone sliding back into socket. Through it all, he did not wake. His face, now that she could see it clearly in the firelight, was striking in its harsh beauty. Black beard, sharp features, a face that spoke of authority and unyielding will. There was something familiar about him, though she could not place why. She worked through the night, changing his bandages, keeping the fire burning, dripping water between his lips whenever he seemed to stir. The fever came hard and fast, his body burning despite the cold, and she spent hours bathing his forehead with cool cloths, whispering prayers to the moon goddess that she had long stopped believing in. "Please," she found herself saying, as dawn broke gray and grim outside her frosted windows. "Please don't die. I don't even know who you are, but please don't die here." His hand, so much larger than hers, twitched. His fingers curled slightly, and without thinking, Thelina slipped her hand into his, holding on as if her touch alone could anchor him to this world. The storm raged for 3 days. During that time, Thelina did not leave her cottage. She could not, even if she had wanted to. The snow piled high against the door, and the wind howled like a chorus of the damned. She tended to her mysterious patient with a dedication that surprised her, changing his bandages, forcing broth between his lips when he was lucid enough to swallow, sitting beside him through the long hours when there was nothing to do but wait. She learned the map of his scars during those days, the long slash across his ribs that must have come from a blade, the circular mark on his shoulder that looked like a burn, the jagged line that ran from his collarbone to his sternum, old and white, the kind of scar that should have killed. Each one spoke of battles fought and survived, of a life lived on the edge of death. She wondered who he was, what had brought him to her forest, her doorstep, whether he had someone who was looking for him, worried about him. On the third night, as the storm finally began to ease, his eyes opened fully for the first time. Thelina was dozing in her chair by the fire, exhausted from days of constant vigilance, when she felt him stir. She jerked awake to find him staring at her, those pale gray eyes sharp and assessing despite his weakened state. "You," he said, his voice rough and low, like gravel grinding against stone. Who are you? She sat up straighter, suddenly very aware of how she must look. Hair tangled, dress rumpled and stained with his blood, dark circles under her eyes. My name is Talina. You were injured. I found you in the storm. He tried to sit up, grunted in pain, and fell back. Where am I? A village on the Frost Peak border. You're safe here. She rose quickly, pouring water into a cup. Don't move too quickly. Your wounds. How long? He interrupted, his eyes never leaving her face. 3 days. The storm just broke. Something flickered across his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or anger. It was hard to read him. 3 days, he repeated, as if testing the words. Then more quietly. You tended to me. It was not a question, but she nodded anyway. You would have died otherwise. Perhaps I should have. The words, spoken so matter-of-factly, made her chest tighten. Don't say that. His eyes narrowed. You don't know what I am. What I've done. I know you're hurt. I know you needed help. That's enough. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, and Talina had the uncomfortable sensation of being dissected, examined, and found wanting. Then, slowly, something in his expression shifted, not softening exactly, but becoming less sharp. My name is Kale, he said finally. She smiled, a small tentative thing. It's nice to meet you, Kyle. He did not return the smile. Instead, he closed his eyes, as if even that brief conversation had exhausted him. Thank you, he murmured, so quietly she almost missed it. For pulling me from the storm. And then he slept, his breathing evening out into something deeper and more restful than the shallow gasps that had characterized his first days. Talina sat back in her chair, her hand pressed to her chest where her heart beat an unfamiliar rhythm. There was something about this man, this Kale, that called to her in a way she did not understand. It was not the pull of a mate bond. She would recognize that, even broken and scarred as she was from her rejection. This was something else. Something quieter, but no less compelling. She told herself it was just the healer's instinct, that she would feel this way about anyone she had saved. But as she watched him sleep, she knew she was lying to herself. The days that followed fell into a strange rhythm. Kale was a difficult patient, stubborn, proud, and clearly unaccustomed to being cared for. He insisted on getting up before he was ready, on testing his healing body despite Talina's protests. More than once she found him trying to put on his ruined clothes, his face pale and jaw clenched against the pain. You're going to tear your stitches, she scolded, guiding him back to the bed she had given up for him while she slept in the chair. I've survived worse, he growled, but he let her settle him back against the pillows. That doesn't mean you should be careless now. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. You're very bossy for an Omega. The words hit her like a slap. He said it casually, as if it were simply an observation, but she felt all her old wounds tear open fresh and raw. Of course he had scented what she was. How could he not? Even though her designation barely registered anymore, even though the rejection had muted so much of her wolf, an alpha would always be able to tell. She turned away, busying herself with straightening already straight bottles on her shelf. Yes, well, in my cottage I make the rules. Talina. Something in the way he said her name made her stop, made her turn back to face him despite every instinct that screamed at her to hide. I did not mean it as an insult, he said, his voice careful in a way it had not been before. Merely an observation. You carry yourself with more confidence than most Omegas I have encountered. Most Omegas you've encountered probably weren't rejected by their fated mates and exiled from their packs, she said, the words bitter on her tongue. His expression shifted. Not pity, which she could not have borne, but something else. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition. Is that what brought you here? To the edge of the world? She shrugged, trying to seem careless even though her hands were shaking. I needed a place to disappear. This seemed as good as any. And have you disappeared? The question was too perceptive, too knowing. She felt exposed under his gaze, as if he could see every secret she had buried deep. I'm trying to. That's a lonely way to live, says the man who was dying alone in a blizzard. The words came out sharper than she intended, defensive. But instead of getting angry, Kyle laughed. A short, rough sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. Touché, little healer. And there it was again, that warmth in her chest that should not be there. She turned back to her work, but she could feel him watching her, and for the first time in a long time, being seen did not make her want to hide. Over the next week, as Kale's strength returned, they fell into a careful dance around each other. The cottage was small, too small really for two people, and they were constantly in each other's space. She would be cooking at her tiny stove and turn to find him right behind her, reaching for the water pitcher. He would be attempting to wash himself at the basin, and she would need to pass to get to her herb stores. Each accidental touch, a brush of hands, a shoulder against hers, sent sparks through her skin. She told herself it meant nothing, that it was just the proximity, the intimacy of having someone in her space after so long alone. But late at night, when she thought he was asleep, she would find herself watching him. The way his chest rose and fell, the way shadows played across his face in the firelight, the way he looked almost peaceful in sleep, all the hardness smoothed away. And sometimes she would catch him watching her too, those pale eyes tracking her movements across the room with an intensity that made her breath catch. They began to talk more. At first, it was practical things. How he was feeling, what he needed, her instructions for his care. But gradually, the conversations deepened. "Why do they call you the Cold Alpha King?" she asked one evening as she changed his bandages. She had learned who he was a few days prior, when he had finally told her, and the revelation had shocked her into silence. The King of Frostpeak, in her cottage. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt strangely safe. His jaw tightened. "Because I am cold. Because I rule without mercy or warmth. Because I have no mate, and want none. That seems like a sad way to rule. It is an effective way to rule. Emotion is weakness, little healer. It makes you vulnerable, exploitable." She tied off the bandage, her fingers gentle. "It also makes you human. Or wolf, I suppose. I am a king before I am anything else. Are you?" She sat back, meeting his eyes. "Is that all you are?" He looked away first, which felt like a victory. "It is all I can afford to be." There was pain in those words, old and deep, and Thelina recognized it because it mirrored her own. "Someone hurt you," she said softly. "Before. Someone made you believe that caring was dangerous." "My father," he said after a long pause. "He loved my mother more than his kingdom. When she died, he followed her within the year, leaving everything in chaos. I was 16. I had to fight my own uncles for the right to rule, had to prove myself through blood and brutality, and I learned that love destroys, that it makes strong men weak and weak men monsters. I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't be. It made me what I am. It made me strong enough to unite the northern territories, to build a kingdom that will outlast me. But at what cost?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something crack in his carefully maintained armor, at the cost of everything else. She wanted to reach for him, to offer comfort, but she held herself back. "Maybe," she said carefully. Strength doesn't have to mean being alone. And maybe, he countered, being alone is the only way to stay strong. They did not speak of it again that night. But the conversation hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. As Cale grew stronger, he began to help around the cottage. She protested at first, worried he would injure himself, but he was stubborn and determined. He chopped wood for the fire, his powerful strokes clean and efficient. He repaired the leaking roof, climbing up despite her anxious protests from below. He fixed the rattling windows, reinforced the door, did a dozen small tasks that she had lived with for so long she had stopped noticing them. "You don't have to do this," she said, watching him work. "You're a king. This is beneath you." He paused, looking down at her from the roof. Snow had begun to fall again, light flurries that caught in his dark hair and beard. "Nothing that needs doing is beneath anyone, Thalina, and I owe you a debt. You don't owe me anything. I owe you my life." The words settled heavy in the air between them. She looked away, suddenly unable to hold his gaze. Anyone would have done the same. "No," he said quietly. "They wouldn't have. Most would have left me to die, or worse, would have tried to claim a reward. You asked for nothing, expected nothing." "Because I wanted nothing," she said, and realized it was not quite true anymore. That evening, as they sat by the fire sharing a simple meal of bread and stew, Kyle asked, "Tell me about him, the alpha who rejected you." Thalina's spoon clattered against her bowl. "Why would you want to know about that?" "Because I want to understand what kind of fool would throw away his fated mate." The words sent heat through her veins, dangerous and thrilling. He wasn't a fool. He was an alpha, a strong one, from a powerful pack. And I am, an omega, the weakest designation. I could offer him nothing. You speak as if you are nothing. In his eyes I was. She set down her bowl, her appetite gone. In everyone's eyes I was. Omegas are meant to be nurturing, supportive, the heart of the pack. But we're also seen as weak, disposable. When the mate bond snapped into place between us, I saw the horror in his eyes, the disgust. He rejected me in front of the entire pack, made sure everyone knew that I was unworthy. And you accepted it. What choice did I have?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "If I had refused, I would have been forced out anyway. At least by accepting, I could leave with some dignity." Kyle was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Then, "He was a fool, and a coward. You don't know him. I don't need to. Any alpha who would reject his mate over something as meaningless as designation is both. The bond is sacred, Thalina. It is the moon goddess's gift. To throw it away is the height of arrogance and stupidity." Something in her chest loosened at his words, a knot she had not even known was there. "You truly believe that?" "I do." He turned to look at her, and the firelight painted his features in gold and shadow. "The designation does not define the wolf. You are not weak, little healer. You pulled a dying king from a blizzard and nursed him back to health. You live alone on the edge of the world and survive. You face each day despite carrying a wound that never truly heals. That is not weakness. That is the truest kind of strength." Tears burned hot in her eyes, threatening to spill over. No one had ever spoken to her like this, had ever seen her as anything other than her designation. "Thank you," she whispered. He reached across the small space between them, and very gently wiped away the single tear that had escaped. His touch was warm and calloused, and impossibly tender. "You deserve to be valued, Thalina. You deserve to be treasured." And in that moment, sitting in her small cottage with the wind howling outside and the fire crackling between them, something shifted. Something clicked into place, like a key turning in a lock. She saw it in his eyes, too. The recognition, the fear, the longing. This was dangerous. This feeling building between them. This connection that had nothing to do with fate and everything to do with choice. She was broken, rejected, a wolf without a pack. He was a king, powerful and cold and married to his throne. They had no future. This could only end in more heartbreak. But as he lowered his hand from her face and returned his gaze to the fire, neither of them pulled away from the warmth growing between them. The weeks passed like a dream. Winter deepened its hold on the land. But inside Thalina's cottage, something was thawing. Cale's wounds healed, the scars joining the collection he already carried. He should have left, should have returned to his kingdom, to his duties. But he stayed, and she did not ask him to go. They filled their days with small domesticities that felt strangely profound. She taught him to cook simple meals, laughing when he burned the bread or oversalted the soup. He taught her to carve wood, his hands guiding hers as they shaped rough timber into smooth forms. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, about the books she had read, about the places he had traveled, about dreams they had given up on and dreams they had never dared to dream. And slowly, the cold king began to melt. She saw it in small moments. The way he smiled more readily, the lines around his eyes crinkling with genuine warmth. The way he hummed while he worked, low and off-key. The way he looked at her when he thought she was not watching, with an expression that made her heart race and her breath catch. One evening, she found him sitting by the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape with a pensive expression. She settled beside him, tucking her legs beneath her. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. "How strange it is," he said, "that I have spent my entire life building walls, and you tore them down without even trying." Her breath caught. "Kyle." "I should have left weeks ago," he continued, still gazing out the window. "My kingdom needs me. My advisors are probably tearing their hair out wondering where I've gone. And yet I cannot bring myself to walk out that door. Why not?" He turned to her then, and the vulnerability in his eyes was almost painful to witness. "Because leaving means walking away from the first peace I have known in decades. Because when I am with you, I remember what it feels like to be a man, instead of just a crown. Because you look at me and see Kale, not the cold Alpha King. You are both," she whispered. "The man and the king. You don't have to choose. But I do. The throne demands everything, Thalina. It leaves no room for softness, for connection, for—" He trailed off, but the unspoken word hung between them. "Love." "Maybe you have been demanding too much of yourself," she said gently. "Maybe the throne does not require you to be alone. Maybe it only requires you to be just." He laughed, but it was a broken sound. "You make it sound so simple." "Nothing about this is simple." She took a breath, gathering her courage. "But I think we are allowed to want things, to need things. Even broken people like us." "You are not broken. Neither are you." They sat in silence after that, shoulders touching, sharing warmth. Outside, the first stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, and Thalina sent up a prayer to the moon goddess, not for fate, not for destiny, but simply for time. A little more time in this bubble they had created, before the world came crashing back in. That night, she woke to the sound of screaming. She bolted upright in her chair, heart pounding, and saw Kale thrashing on the bed, caught in the grip of a nightmare. Sweat soaked his skin despite the cold, and his face was twisted in anguish. "No," he gasped, his voice raw. "No, please." She was at his side in an instant, her hands on his shoulders. "Kale, wake up. You're safe. You're here with me." His eyes snapped open, wild and unseeing, and for a moment she thought he might strike out. But then recognition flooded his features, and he slumped back against the pillows, breathing hard. "I'm sorry," he rasped. "I didn't mean to wake you." "Don't apologize." She poured water with shaking hands and helped him drink. "What were you dreaming about?" He was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. Then, "The war. The battles I fought to claim my throne. I see their faces sometimes. The men I killed, the blood I spilled. It never truly leaves you, the taking of life. You did what you had to do." "Did I?" He looked at her, his eyes haunted. "Or did I simply choose power over peace? I told myself it was necessary, that I was building something greater. But sometimes I wonder if I just became another tyrant, ruling through fear." Thelina sat on the edge of the bed, her hand finding his. A tyrant would not question himself, would not care about the cost. The fact that you carry this weight means you are not what you fear. His fingers tightened around hers. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Make me believe I can be better than I am." "Because you already are better than you think," she said simply. "You just need to let yourself see it." He pulled her closer then, until her head rested against his shoulder, and she could feel the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. They stayed like that until dawn, neither sleeping, neither speaking, just existing together in the quiet dark. And in that moment, Thelina felt something she had thought lost forever: hope. The first thaw of spring was still weeks away when everything changed. Cale had been with her for nearly 2 months, and the cottage had become a sanctuary for them both. They had settled into a routine that felt like it could last forever, even though they both knew it could not. He still did not speak of leaving, and she did not ask. But the world has a way of finding you, no matter how well you hide. They were in the garden, checking on the herbs that Thelina hoped would survive beneath the snow, when Cale suddenly went rigid. His head snapped up, nostrils flaring, every line of his body taut with alertness. "What is it?" Thelina asked, alarm skittering up her spine. "Wolves," he said tersely, "coming fast, many of them." She heard them then, the distant sound of paws thundering through snow, of voices raised in pursuit. Fear clutched at her heart. Had Marcus's pack found her? Had they come to finish what the rejection started? But then the wolves burst from the tree line, and she saw the insignia on their clothes, the crowned wolf of Frostpeak. Cale's wolves. They shifted as they entered the clearing, and a tall man with silver hair and sharp features immediately dropped to one knee. "Your Majesty, thank the goddess we've found you. We've been searching for weeks." "Stand up, Roland," Cale said, his voice taking on the commanding tone Thelina had never heard from him. In an instant, he was no longer the man who had shared her meals and her stories. He was the king, cold and distant and untouchable. "Report." Roland rose, his eyes flicking to Thelina with open curiosity before returning to his king. "After the storm, when you did not return from your scouting mission, we feared the worst. Your Majesty, you cannot simply disappear like that. The kingdom—" "I am aware of my duties, Beta." Cale's voice was ice. "Prepare to move out. We return to Frostpeak immediately." "Yes, Your Majesty." As Roland turned to organize the other wolves, Cale finally looked at Thelina. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the war between the man and the king. But when he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "Thank you for your hospitality, Miss Ashwood. You will be compensated for your time and resources." The formality of his words struck her like a physical blow. Miss Ashwood, as if they were strangers. As if the last 2 months had meant nothing. She wanted to scream at him, to demand that he stay, to beg him not to disappear behind his walls again. But pride, that stubborn, foolish thing, kept her spine straight and her voice level. "That won't be necessary, Your Majesty. I was simply doing my duty. Something flickered in his eyes. Pain, regret. But it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement, and turned away. She watched them prepare to leave, watched Kale transform completely into the cold Alpha King, barking orders and organizing his wolves with military efficiency. He did not look at her again, did not say goodbye. And then they were gone, disappearing back into the forest as quickly as they had come. And Thalina was alone once more. She stood in the garden long after they had left, the cold seeping into her bones, and told herself that the wetness on her cheeks was melting snow and nothing more. The cottage felt enormous in its emptiness. Thalina moved through the next days like a ghost, going through the motions of living without truly being present. She cleaned obsessively, scrubbing away every trace of Kale's presence. The chair he had sat in, the bed he had slept on, the tools he had used to fix her roof. She told herself she was being practical, returning her space to the way it had been before. But late at night, she would catch herself reaching for someone who was not there, would turn to share a thought with no one, would wake from dreams where pale gray eyes looked at her with warmth and longing. She had been alone before, had built a life from the ashes of her rejection. She could do it again. Except this time, the loneliness hurt worse. Because this time, she knew what she was missing, knew what it felt like to be seen, to be valued, to matter to someone. The winter gradually softened into early spring. The snows melted, revealing the brown earth beneath. The village began to stir with renewed energy, preparing for planting season. Thalina threw herself into work, taking on more tasks, volunteering for every job that needed doing, but nothing could fill the hollow space in her chest. She was in the tavern one evening, serving drinks to the few patrons who had braved the muddy roads, when the door banged open and a wolf stumbled in. He was young, barely more than a boy, and bleeding from a wound on his side. Thalina was at his side immediately, her healer's instincts overriding everything else. What happened? Raiders, the boy gasped. From the Crimson Veil Pack. They attacked our merchant caravan, claimed we were on their territory. They're pushing into Frost Peak lands, challenging the borders. Crimson Veil. Marcus's pack. Something cold and hard settled in Thalina's stomach. She helped the boy to a chair, tended his wound while the other villagers gathered around, whispering worries about war and invasion. Over the next weeks, the news only got worse. Crimson Veil had apparently decided that Frost Peak's king had grown weak, disappearing for months and emerging changed. They saw an opportunity to expand their territory, to claim the mineral-rich lands that bordered both kingdoms. Skirmishes broke out along the frontier. Villages were raided. Wolves died on both sides. And Thalina, safe in her remote cottage, felt the guilt eating away at her. This was happening because Kale had stayed with her, had been delayed in returning to his duties. Because she had been selfish enough to let him stay, to want him to stay. She should have sent him away immediately, should have known better than to let herself care. It was late spring when Roland appeared at her door. She was hanging laundry in her garden when she looked up to find him standing at the edge of her property, no longer in wolf form, but still intimidating in his formal Frost Peak uniform. "Miss Ashwood," he said, inclining his head. "May I speak with you?" Her heart hammered against her ribs. If this is about payment for caring for the king, I told him, "It's not about payment." Roland's expression was troubled. "May I come in?" She led him inside, poured tea with hands that trembled slightly, and sat across from him. He studied her with sharp eyes, and she had the uncomfortable sensation of being assessed and measured. "You should know," Roland said finally, "that the king has not been himself since returning to Frost Peak." Thalina's hands tightened around her cup. "I don't see what that has to do with me." "Don't you?" His voice was gentle, not accusatory. He's become even colder than before, if such a thing is possible. He throws himself into military matters with a single-mindedness that borders on obsession. He barely sleeps, barely eats. And he has never, in all the years I have served him, been as cruel as he is now. Not to others, but to himself. Why are you telling me this? Because I spent 2 hours with him in the cottage, the day we found him. While we waited for the rest of the search party to regroup, I watched him look at you. I saw his face when he had to leave. Roland leaned forward, his voice intense. King Cale is a good ruler, Miss Ashwood. He is just and fair and has brought unprecedented prosperity to our lands. But he is not a good man to himself. He has convinced himself that he must be alone, that caring for anything beyond his duty is a weakness. And then he met you. He left, Thelina said, her voice cracking despite her efforts to control it. He walked away without a word. Because he is terrified. Because for the first time in his life, he wants something for himself, and he does not know how to reconcile that with everything he believes about strength and duty. Thelina stood abruptly, pacing to the window. He is a king. I am a rejected Omega living in exile. There is no world where this ends well. Perhaps not, Roland acknowledged. But does that mean it is not worth trying? Miss Ashwood, Thelina, the king is planning a campaign against Crimson Vale, a full assault to push them back and establish dominance. It is a good strategy, a necessary one. But I have seen war, and I know what it does to men, especially men who have nothing left to lose. She turned to face him, understanding dawning cold and heavy. You think he is going to do something reckless. I think he is going to win the war, but I do not know if he will survive it. Not because he lacks skill, but because he has stopped caring whether he does. Roland stood, moving to stand beside her. He needs something to fight for beyond duty, someone to come home to. And whether you want to accept it or not, you are that someone. He does not want me. He wants you so much it terrifies him. Roland pulled something from his pocket, a small carved figure, a wolf sitting peacefully beneath a tree. I found him making this the night before we found him. He would not say who it was for, but I think we both know. Thelina took the carving with shaking hands. It was beautiful, the details intricate and loving. She could see herself in it, the slightly wild hair, the delicate features, the way the wolf seemed both cautious and hopeful. What do you want me to do? She whispered. Come to Frost Peak. Let him see you. Remind him that there is more to life than ice and duty and loneliness. Roland's voice softened. Or don't. Return to your solitude, and I will tell him I never found you. The choice is yours, Thelina, but choose quickly. The campaign begins in 2 weeks. He left her there, standing in her cottage with the wooden wolf clutched to her chest, and for the first time since Cale had walked away, Thelina let herself feel everything she had been holding back. The anger and the hurt and the longing and the love. Yes, love, because that is what it was. No matter how much she had tried to deny it, she loved him. The cold king who had melted in her care. The broken man who had seen her scars and called her strong. The lonely soul who had found peace in her simple cottage. And if there was even a chance, even the smallest possibility that they could have something together, did she not owe it to them both to try? She packed her bag that night, told the village elder she would be gone for a time, and set out at dawn with Roland as her guide. The journey to Frost Peak took 5 days. Thelina had never seen the capital before, had never ventured this deep into the northern territories. The city rose from the mountains like something out of a dream. White stone towers that gleamed in the sunlight, streets wide and clean, wolves moving with purpose and prosperity. It was beautiful and intimidating and utterly foreign to her small, quiet world. Roland led her through the palace gates, past guards who stared at her with open curiosity, through corridors lined with tapestries and statues. Everything here spoke of power and wealth and permanence. She felt small and shabby in her simple traveling clothes, her hair windblown and her boots muddy. "He's in the war room," Roland said, as they climbed a spiral staircase. "Fair warning, he is not going to react well to this interruption. But stand your ground. He needs you, even if he cannot admit it. And if he sends me away? Then I will personally escort you home and apologize for wasting your time." Roland smiled, but there was steel beneath it. "But I do not think he will." They stopped before a heavy wooden door, and Roland knocked twice before pushing it open. Inside, a large table dominated the room, covered in maps and markers. Several wolves in military dress stood around it, and at the head of the table, studying the maps with fierce concentration, was Cale. He looked different here. Harder, colder, more like the king and less like the man. His beard was trimmed close, his hair tied back, and he wore armor that caught the light like black ice. When he looked up at the interruption, his eyes were chips of frozen stone. "Roland, I said I was not to be disturbed." His voice died as his gaze landed on Talina. The room went deathly silent. Every wolf present turned to stare at her, and Talina felt her resolve waver under their scrutiny. But then she remembered the carving in her bag, remembered the way Cale had looked at her by firelight, and she lifted her chin. "Your Majesty," she said, and was proud that her voice did not shake. "I apologize for the interruption, but I need to speak with you." "Everyone out," Kyle said, his eyes never leaving hers. His voice was flat, emotionless. The advisors filed out quickly, Roland last. He caught Talina's eye and nodded once, encouraging, before closing the door behind him. And then they were alone. Cale moved around the table slowly, like a predator stalking prey, until he stood only a few feet away. "What are you doing here, Talina?" "I came to see you." "Why?" The single word was sharp, almost hostile. But she could see beneath it, could see the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, the tension in his shoulders, the careful distance he maintained. "Because I was told you are planning something foolish. Because I was told you have forgotten what you are fighting for." His jaw tightened. "I am fighting for my kingdom, for my people. What more reason do I need?" "Maybe a reason to come home when the fighting is done." He turned away from her, bracing his hands on the table, his back rigid. "You should not have come here." "Why not?" "Because I cannot give you what you want." "And what do I want?" She moved closer, her heart pounding. "A mate, a partner, someone who can be there for you, who can give you the life you deserve." His voice was rough, strained. "I cannot be that, Talina. I am a king first, last, and always. There is no room in my life for anything else. I never asked you to give up your throne. But you ask me to give up my isolation, to let you in, to care." He looked at her over his shoulder, and the anguish in his eyes took her breath away. "Do you not understand how dangerous that is? If I care, I become vulnerable. If I become vulnerable, I become weak. And if I become weak, everything I have built will crumble. That is not true. It is." He spun to face her, and there was desperation in every line of his body. "You make me weak, Talina. When I am with you, I forget my duty. I forget my purpose. I become just a man, and a king cannot afford to be just a man." "Why not?" Her voice rose to match his. "Why can you not be both? Why must you choose between duty and happiness?" "Because my father made that choice, and it destroyed everything." The words tore from him like a wound breaking open. "He chose my mother over the kingdom, and when she died, He followed her and left me to clean up the chaos. I was 16 years old, fighting my own family for the right to rule because he had been too weak to secure the succession properly. I watched my kingdom nearly tear itself apart because one man loved too much. So instead you have chosen to love not at all. Tears burned in her eyes. You have sentenced yourself to a lifetime of loneliness because you are afraid? I am not afraid, he snarled, but it was a lie and they both knew it. You are terrified, she said softly, moving even closer. You are so afraid of losing control, of being hurt, of being abandoned, that you have built walls so high you cannot see over them. But Kale, those walls are not protecting you. They are imprisoning you. He shook his head, backing away from her. You do not understand. Then help me understand. She followed him, refusing to let him retreat. Tell me why a man who fought so hard for his kingdom is willing to throw his life away in battle. Tell me why you carve figures of wolves in peaceful gardens if you believe peace is weakness. Tell me why you look at me like I am the only thing in the world that matters, and then walk away. Because if I stay, I will ruin you. The words exploded from him, echoing in the war room. Do you not see? I am cold and broken and I do not know how to be anything else. You deserve warmth, Thelina. You deserve someone who can love you properly, without reservation, without the weight of a kingdom on their shoulders. And I... His voice broke. Actually broke. The cold Alpha King shattering before her eyes. I am so tired, he whispered. I am so tired of being alone, of being strong, of pretending that I do not need anyone, that I am enough by myself. And then you appeared in the storm, and you saw me, really saw me. And I... He closed his eyes, his breathing ragged. I cannot do this. I cannot let myself need you and then lose you. I cannot survive it. Thelina felt her heart breaking and mending all at once. She closed the distance between them and took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. You are not your father, Kale. Loving someone does not make you weak. It makes you human. It gives you something worth fighting for, instead of something to die for. I do not know how to do this, he confessed, his hands coming up to cover hers. I do not know how to be anything other than a king. Then learn. She smiled through her tears. We will figure it out together. You do not have to choose, Kale. You can be a king and a man. You can have duty and happiness. You just have to be brave enough to try. I do not feel brave. Bravery is not the absence of fear. It is acting despite it. She stroked her thumbs across his cheekbones, feeling the wetness there. I am terrified too. I was rejected and broken, and I spent so long believing I was unworthy of love. But you made me feel valuable again. You made me feel seen. And if there is even a chance that we could have something beautiful together, I want to take it. Even if it is hard. Even if it is complicated. Even if it scares me. Kyle pulled her into his arms then, crushing her against his chest, his face buried in her hair. She felt him shaking, felt the years of loneliness and pain and denial cracking open. I do not deserve you, he murmured against her skin. Neither of us deserves the other. But maybe that is not the point. Maybe we just choose each other anyway. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes red but clearer than she had ever seen them. And then, slowly, carefully, as if she were something precious, he kissed her. It was not the kiss of fate or destiny. It was the kiss of choice, of two broken people deciding to heal together. His lips were gentle but desperate, tender but hungry, and when they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. Stay, he whispered. Please stay. I am not going anywhere, she promised. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Cale Northbourne smiled. A real smile, warm and genuine and full of hope. The campaign against Crimson Vale was swift and decisive. With renewed purpose, Chaol led his armies south, driving back the invading forces and reclaiming the disputed territories. But this time, he fought with the careful strategy of a man who had something to lose, who had someone to return to. He took no unnecessary risks, listened to his advisors, and thought 3 moves ahead. Thelina waited for him in Frostpeak, learning the ins and outs of palace life, slowly earning the respect of the court wolves who had been suspicious of her at first. Roland became her guide and friend, teaching her the politics and protocols she would need to navigate. And at night, when the worry became too much, she would sit in Chaol's chambers, now their chambers, and work on the tapestry she was making, keeping her hands busy and her mind occupied. The final battle took place at the Crimson Vale border, on the very grounds where Thelina had been rejected 2 years prior. Chaol stood before Alpha Marcus's fortress and issued a challenge: single combat, alpha to alpha, with the disputed territories as the prize. Marcus accepted, arrogant and confident that he could defeat the cold Alpha King. He had heard the rumors that Chaol had softened, that a rejected Omega had somehow wormed her way into his heart, and he believed that made him vulnerable. He was wrong. Chaol fought with the focus of a seasoned warrior, but also with the heart of a man who had something precious to protect. He was not fighting for pride or power. He was fighting for the right to build a life with the woman he loved. And that made all the difference. The battle was brutal, but brief. Marcus fell, defeated but alive, and yielded the territories to Frostpeak. But Chaol was not done. Standing in the center of the Crimson Vale territory, surrounded by both armies, he made a declaration that would echo through the packs for generations. Alpha Marcus rejected his fated mate because she was an Omega, because he deemed her unworthy. But Thelina Ashwood is the worthiest wolf I have ever known. She is brave and strong and kind, and she saved my life when she had no reason to. The moon goddess chose her for Marcus, and he threw away that gift. Well, I do not believe in fate, but I believe in choice, and I choose Thelina. I choose her today, tomorrow, and every day after. And any wolf who thinks designation matters more than character is a fool who does not deserve to lead. The declaration sent shockwaves through both packs. To publicly claim a rejected Omega, to elevate her above traditional pack politics, was unprecedented. But Chaol was not asking for permission. He was stating a fact. Marcus, bleeding and broken on the ground, looked up at the king with something like understanding. "She was wasted on me," he said quietly. "I see that now." Chaol did not respond. He simply turned and walked away, his army falling into formation behind him. But he did do one more thing. Before leaving Crimson Vale territory, he issued a decree. The pack would be absorbed into Frostpeak, its wolves given the choice to integrate or leave. And Alpha Marcus would step down, replaced by leaders chosen not by bloodline, but by merit. It was a mercy Marcus did not deserve, and everyone knew it. But Chaol had learned something important. That true strength was not just in conquest, but in knowing when to show compassion. He returned to Frostpeak a week later, victorious and whole, and found Thelina waiting for him at the palace gates. She ran to him, and he caught her up in his arms, spinning her around as the gathered crowd cheered. And there, in front of his entire kingdom, he kissed her soundly, declaring without words that she was his, and he was hers, and anyone who had a problem with that could challenge him for the throne. No one did. Summer came to the north, warm and golden. Thelina adjusted to life as Chaol's partner, not his mate, for that bond was still broken, but something they had chosen themselves, which made it more precious. She helped him govern with a gentle wisdom that balanced his sometimes harsh pragmatism. She opened an infirmary in the palace, using her healing skills to help any wolf who needed it, regardless of rank or designation. And slowly, she began to change the culture of Frostpeak from within, proving that Omegas were not weak, that designation did not determine worth. And Kyle, the once cold Alpha King, learned to laugh again, to play, to live for more than duty. He was still a strong ruler, still commanded respect and loyalty. But he was also softer now, more approachable, more willing to show mercy and compassion. His people loved him for it, and the kingdom prospered under their combined leadership. It was late autumn when Thelina realized she was pregnant. She stood in their chambers, staring at herself in the mirror, her hand pressed to her still flat stomach, and felt joy and terror in equal measure. She had not thought it possible. Rejected mates rarely bore children, the broken bond making conception difficult if not impossible. But here she was, carrying new life, carrying hope. When she told Cale that evening, he simply stared at her for a long moment. Then he dropped to his knees before her, pressing his forehead to her stomach, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for giving me this, for giving me everything." The pregnancy was difficult but worth it. And on a cold winter morning, exactly 2 years after Thelina had found Kyle dying in the snow, their son was born. They named him Rowan, after the trees that grew outside Thelina's old cottage, the place where their story had truly begun. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes, and from the moment he entered the world, he was loved beyond measure. 6 months later, on a warm spring afternoon, they held a ceremony to present Rowan to the kingdom. The entire capital gathered in the palace courtyard, wolves from every corner of Frostpeak and beyond, all come to witness this moment. Thelina stood on the balcony, Rowan in her arms, and felt overwhelmed by the crowd below. But then Cale was there, his hand on her back, steadying her. He looked different now than he had 2 years ago. The coldness had melted from his eyes, replaced by warmth and contentment. He smiled more easily, held her freely, and was not afraid to show his love in public. "Ready?" he murmured. She nodded, and together they stepped forward to the edge of the balcony. The crowd fell silent, every eye turned upward. Kyle raised his hand, and his voice rang out clear and strong across the courtyard. "People of Frostpeak, I present to you Crown Prince Rowan, heir to the Northern Throne, born of choice and love and the belief that we can always become more than our past." The crowd erupted in cheers, the sound rolling like thunder across the city. Thelina looked down at her son, then at her partner, and felt tears slip down her cheeks. Happy tears this time, grateful tears. Cale leaned close, his lips brushing her temple. "I love you," he said, loud enough that the nearest nobles could hear, caring nothing for propriety or protocol. "I love you, Thelina Ashwood, and I will spend every day for the rest of my life proving that love is not weakness. It is the truest strength." She turned her face to his, kissing him softly. "And I love you, Cale Northbourne, my cold king who learned to feel the sun." As the afternoon light painted them in gold, as their son cooed contentedly and their people celebrated below, Thelina thought about the journey that had brought them here. The rejection and the storm, the loneliness and the healing, the fear and the courage to try anyway. She had been broken once. He had been frozen. But together, they had created something warm and alive and beautiful. And that, she knew, was worth every moment of darkness that had come before. Because in the end, the strongest wolves were not the ones who needed no one. They were the ones who were brave enough to need, to want, to love, and to let themselves be loved in return. The celebration continued into the evening, music and laughter filling the palace. But Thelina and Kyle slipped away early, carrying their sleeping son back to their chambers, where they sat together by the window and watched the stars emerge one by one. "Do you ever miss it?" Kyle asked quietly. "The quiet life? The cottage?" Thelina considered the question, then shook her head. "I miss the simplicity sometimes. But I would not trade this for anything. Not the kingdom, not the title, but this. You and Rowan and the life we are building together. I sometimes think about the man I was before you, Cale admitted. Cold and alone and convinced that was strength. And I am grateful every day that you did not leave me to freeze in that storm. I could never have left you. She rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. Even then, before I knew you, something told me you were important, that you mattered. Fate? He teased gently. Choice, she corrected. Always choice. He kissed the top of her head, his arms tightening around her. Then I choose you, Thelina. Today, tomorrow, always. And I choose you. Outside, the northern lights began to dance across the sky, ribbons of green and gold and blue painting the darkness with beauty. Inside, a family born not of destiny but of decision, sat together in the warm glow of firelight, healing each other with every breath, every touch, every moment they chose to stay. And far away, in a small cottage on the edge of the world, the hearth remained cold, but the memories were warm. Of a cold king who learned to melt, and a rejected Omega who learned that she was never broken at all. She was, and always had been, exactly enough. The years would bring challenges, as all years do. But they would face them together. This unlikely pair who had defied every expectation and proven that the most powerful bonds are not the ones fate ties, but the ones we tie ourselves, with hope and trust in the simple, radical act of choosing love again and again and again. And in a world of alphas and omegas, of power and designation, of destiny and duty, they created something rare and precious, a partnership of equals, a love built on respect and understanding, a family born from the ashes of what could have been and transformed into what was always meant to be. Not because the moon goddess willed it, but because two broken wolves decided that broken did not mean beyond repair, that cold could always find warmth, that even the loneliest hearts could learn to open, and that sometimes the best endings come from the darkest beginnings, if we are brave enough to keep walking through the storm, trusting that somewhere, somehow, there is shelter waiting. Somewhere, somehow, there is home. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this beautiful love story. Let us know what you thought of this tale full of emotions and surprises. Tell us your name, where you're watching from, and rate this story from 0 to 10 if it touched your heart. And if you enjoyed the plot, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the amazing new stories coming soon. See you next time.